15 days. That's how long Cuba has before the lights go out, permanently. Not a power outage, not a blackout, total collapse. 11 million people, no electricity, no water pumps, no hospitals, no food refrigeration. 15 days. And the clock is ticking right now while you're watching this. February 2026. An island 90 miles from Miami is about to become ground zero for the question that will define this decade. Can economic warfare force regime change without firing a single shot? And will Russia and China actually back up their promises when the cost gets real? Because here's what nobody's telling you. This isn't 1962, where superpowers negotiated over Cuba's head during the missile crisis. This is 2026, where Washington just weaponized oil as the ultimate choke point. Moscow pledges necessary support but won't say when. Beijing condemns the siege but won't commit tankers, and Mexico is caught between revolutionary solidarity and economic survival. Meanwhile, in Havana, the blackouts stretch 26 hours straight. Hospitals operate without medication, and food prices exceed monthly salaries by a factor of 10. Let me show you exactly how Cuba arrived at this precipice, what happens when the countdown hits zero, and why what's about to unfold will reshape global power dynamics for the next generation. January 3rd, 2026, 2 a.m., Caracas, Venezuela. Delta Force operators backed by CIA intelligence storm Nicolás Maduro's compound. Explosions light up northern Venezuela as U.S. bombers suppress air defenses. Dozens die in the firefight. Hours later, Maduro gets photographed aboard USS Iwo Jima, blindfolded, soundproof headphones, bound for New York arraignment on narco-terrorism charges. Among the casualties, 32 Cuban soldiers killed, Cuban military and intelligence personnel embedded in Maduro's personal protection detail. Because Cuba didn't just support Venezuela diplomatically. Cuba effectively ran Venezuela's entire security apparatus. 32,000 Cuban operatives embedded in Venezuelan intelligence, internal security, even Maduro's protection team. When Delta Force captured Maduro, they didn't just topple a dictator, they killed Cuba's entire economic model. Here's why. Venezuela supplied Cuba with 46,500 barrels of oil per day before that raid, subsidized crude at below market rates, the arrangement that kept Cuban lights on since Hugo Chavez declared the two countries living in a sea of happiness back in 1999. The deal was simple. Cuba sent troops, intelligence, and regime protection. Venezuela sent oil. That partnership terminated the exact moment Maduro got arrested. Mexico had been Cuba's secondary supplier, 17,000 barrels per day. Within weeks of the Venezuela operation, those shipments halted too under pressure from Trump administration threats to weaponize USMCA renegotiation. Do the math. Cuba loses roughly 63,700 barrels daily. Cuba needs approximately 60,000 barrels per day just to maintain basic electricity. There's no margin. There's no backup plan. There's just the countdown clock. Cuba didn't just lose oil. It lost the revenue stream from reselling Venezuelan crude at market rates while paying subsidized prices. Hard currency that financed food and medicine imports, gone. The military partnership anchoring Cuba's regional security posture, dissolved. The assumption that great power patrons would seamlessly replace Venezuela if something went wrong, about to get tested under the worst possible conditions. The Venezuela-Cuba relationship wasn't just an oil deal, it was the economic architecture that allowed Cuba's system to survive after Soviet subsidies ended. Between 1999 and 2013, Chavez supplied up to 100,000 barrels daily. That was worth up to $1.5 billion a year in subsidized value. Cuba provided the security expertise that kept Chavez and later Maduro in power against coup attempts, protests, and internal threats. Cuban operatives trained Venezuelan intelligence services, monitored military loyalty, protected the president personally. When Maduro faced his own survival crises, Cuban personnel were the regime's backbone. But here's what that partnership masked: structural economic decay. While Venezuelan oil kept the generators running, Cuba's domestic production collapsed. Sugar harvests that historically measured in millions of metric tons, down to 165,000 tons in 2024-25. Real wages adjusted for inflation, down 96% since 2015. Agricultural mechanization, farmers are literally switching from tractors back to oxen. And then those oxen get stolen for food because people are starving. The dependency created a fatal vulnerability. When your economy runs on someone else's oil like a patient runs on an IV drip, you don't diversify, you don't reform, you don't build resilience. You assume the drip continues because it always has. Until January 3rd when someone cut the line. This is the Venezuela lesson applied to Cuba. Patron-client relationships work perfectly until the patron implodes or gets regime changed by a superpower. Then your entire model dies too. Cuba didn't have to prepare for this scenario because for 25 years, it never happened. Now it's happening in real time. And there are 15 days of reserves left. January 29th, 2026. One day before Secretary of State Marco Rubio testifies to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about Cuba policy, President Trump signs Executive Order 14380. The mechanics are brutally simple. The Commerce and State Departments identify which countries sell oil to Cuba. The president sets tariff rates on goods from those countries. If shipments continue, tariffs escalate. This isn't subtle diplomacy. This is economic siege warfare codified into executive action. Listen to Rubio's Senate testimony on January 28th. He acknowledges explicitly that regime change is the goal. The 1996 Helms-Burton Act codifies the embargo until Cuba's government changes. Title III, activated by Trump in 2019 after 20 years dormant, allows U.S. nationals to sue Cuban entities for properties expropriated after 1959. The Supreme Court is hearing cases on whether Cuban government entities lose sovereign immunity. This creates pathways to seize Cuban assets globally if regime change succeeds. This isn't about human rights accountability. This is about economic siege as regime change doctrine. Mexico feels the pressure immediately. Republican lawmakers Carlos Jimenez, Mario Diaz-Balart, and Maria Elvira Salazar explicitly threaten to weaponize USMCA renegotiation if Mexico keeps selling oil to Cuba. Trump personally requests President Claudia Sheinbaum suspend shipments. Sheinbaum is navigating an impossible tightrope. Her leftist orientation demands solidarity with Cuba, but Mexican economic survival depends on avoiding tariffs that would devastate exports. Her compromise? Commercial oil sales halted under pressure. Humanitarian assistance, food, and goods via Mexican Navy pledged and delivered. Oil shipments for humanitarian reasons remain under diplomatic negotiation. The distinction matters legally, but functionally, Cuba's losing those 17,000 barrels per day. The international community votes 165-7 against the embargo at the UN General Assembly. International law scholars call secondary sanctions tariffs on third countries for their independent transactions, violations of sovereignty. The U.S. frames it as accountability for a regime that tortures dissidents and imprisons 650 political prisoners from July 2021 protests. Washington turned oil into a choke point. Now the question becomes, who is actually willing to break the blockade? And who just makes promises while satellites track empty tanker routes? Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov calls the U.S. pressure unacceptable, pledges necessary political and material support, condemns Executive Order 1380 as illegal under the UN Charter. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova frames this as Washington's maximum pressure strategy violating international law. Here's what they're actually doing. Rosneft loaded 100,000 tons of crude onto the academic Gubkin in January. Expected mid-February arrival at Cuba's Matanzas terminal. 100,000 tons translates to roughly 20 days of consumption at current rates. That buys time. It doesn't solve the crisis. And the volumes are declining dramatically. Russia sent 600,000 tons in 2022, 200,000 in 2023, 100,000 in 2024. Russia's constrained by Ukraine war resource demands, sanctions targeting its shadow fleet, and limited capacity for major Caribbean commitments. Moscow maintains the Lourdes intelligence facility demonstrating global reach, but won't risk direct U.S. confrontation over Cuba. Signaling presence is one thing. Sustaining a besieged economy 90 miles from Miami is another. Beijing condemns the blockade, pledges as much support as possible, votes with the 165-nation majority against the embargo. China frames this as principled opposition to unilateral coercive measures violating sovereignty. What's conspicuously missing? Confirmed oil shipments. China's investing in Cuban infrastructure, holding diplomatic meetings, signaling great power status. But Chinese tankers aren't sailing for Havana. Beijing won't challenge U.S. hemispheric dominance for Cuba when the risks include economic retaliation that could cascade through China's core interests. The telling silence speaks volumes. Rhetoric costs nothing. Crude oil deliveries cost real money and carry real consequences. That gap defines great power solidarity. Sheinbaum's caught between revolutionary solidarity, her political base expects support for Cuba, and economic survival. Pemex supplies only 3% of crude exports to Cuba, minimal economically, massive politically. The reality? If Sheinbaum caves completely, Cuba hits zero in 15 to 20 days. If she defies Trump, Mexico risks tariffs dwarfing Cuba's strategic importance. So she splits the difference. Humanitarian aid flows. Commercial sales stop. And diplomatic negotiations continue while the clock ticks. Mexico's the only realistic near-term supplier with proximity and capacity. And Washington knows it. Oil deliveries get tracked by satellite. While diplomats talk, Cuba's reserves drain. Here's what that looks like on the ground for actual Cuban people. 26 hours of blackouts consecutively in many regions. The Antonio Guterres thermoelectric plant offline, eliminating 200 megawatts. National deficit hits 75% of demand during peak hours. Kepler energy analyst Victoria Grabenwoga's assessment is chilling. Cuba can function for 15 to 20 days at current consumption. After that, energy collapse. No electricity means no water pumping. Artemisa province, 83% water access reduction. Havana, 80%. No refrigeration means food spoilage. No hospital equipment. No public transport. The peso lost 10% in 3 weeks as of early February, down 88% since 2020. Informal exchange rate, 405 pesos per dollar versus the official 24. Food prices in early 2026 are absolutely devastating. Potatoes, 450 pesos per pound. Onions, 380. Beans, 500. Meat, 1,000. A modest grocery purchase costs 10,300 pesos. Average state worker salary, 6,830 pesos monthly. Teachers earn 5,495. Healthcare workers, 6,562. A Cuban doctor earning 4,500 pesos makes roughly $16 at informal rates. Per month, not per hour, per month. Dengue and Oropouche virus outbreak. 38,938 cases. 33 deaths in 1 week in late 2025. 21 of them minors, children. Hospitals lack diagnostic reagents, antibiotics, basic supplies. Patients get sent home to rest without treatment because medications literally don't exist. The MedSip company expands plant-based syrups. Oregano, eucalyptus, aloe vera, not because they work, but because there's nothing else. A 69-year-old housekeeper reports her 10-minute commute now takes 4 hours round trip due to transportation collapse. The cost consumes her entire wages. Taxi drivers wait at digital queues showing position 2,900, estimating 2 months to reach the front for fuel sold in dollars at inflated prices. This is what maximum pressure looks like in practice. While Washington, Moscow, and Beijing play geopolitical chess, Cubans count hours of darkness. Now the critical question: can the regime actually survive what's coming? President Miguel Díaz-Canel's messaging remains defiant and uncompromising. Patria o muerte, homeland or death. We will never surrender. Dialogue possible on equal terms, with respect, without preconditions, but dialogue cannot occur under pressure. Military readiness rhetoric, war of the entire people exercises, National Defense Day invoking the cost imperialism would pay for attacking Cuba, references to the 32 Cubans killed fighting U.S. forces in Venezuela, but the constraints tell a very different story. Cuban military declined from 300,000 personnel to 60,000 during earlier crises. Training suspended due to resource shortages. Agriculture switching from tractors to oxen, which then get stolen for food. Tourism down 72% through April 2025. Sugar production, 165,000 tons versus historical millions. The Economic Commission for Latin America forecasts Cuba's GDP shrinking 1.5% in 2025. Barely any growth in 2026, second worst performance in the Western Hemisphere after Haiti. The cohesion question becomes critical. Does the GISA military apparatus maintain elite unity when they can't provision their own supporters? Do factions emerge around negotiation versus resistance strategies? 650 political prisoners still jailed from 2021 protests. Repression capacity remains intact, but public exhaustion is deepening. Trump's strategy remains deliberately ambiguous. Public messaging oscillates. Cuba is ready to fall. Going down for the count. I don't think we need any action. Also, I think we're going to make a deal with Cuba, no term specified. Politico reports naval blockade under discussion. Energy chokehold to kill the regime without invasion. The regime says it won't surrender. Washington says collapse is inevitable. Neither claim tells you what actually happens in the next 30 days. Let me walk you through 5 possible scenarios. Scenario 1. Managed degradation. International support provides just enough to prevent total failure, but not restoration. Crisis becomes permanent condition. 12-hour blackouts, severe scarcity. Security apparatus maintains control. Population lacks organization for sustained uprising. Special period 2.0, indefinite duration. Scenario 2, negotiated transition. Oil depletion forces Díaz-Canel to accept terms. Prisoner releases, political reforms, economic liberalization in exchange for sanctions relief and oil access. Face-saving diplomatic framework masks fundamental regime concession. U.S. claims victory without invasion. Cuba claims sovereignty preserved. Scenario 3, internal fracture. Oil runs out completely. Services collapse. Elite unity breaks when GISA can't feed its own. Military coup, reformist transition, or negotiated exit depending on whether factions see survival in change versus doubling down. Scenario 4, external intervention. Naval blockade to halt all oil imports. Supreme Court ruling jeopardizes authority. Forces military option. Russian and Chinese response unknown. Unlikely but not impossible if humanitarian catastrophe creates political pressure for rescue operation. Scenario 5, unexpected stabilization. Russia or China dramatically increase support as multipolarity demonstration. Trump accepts face-saving deal. Venezuelan transition government restores limited flows. Requires all major actors shifting positions simultaneously. 5 scenarios, 1 countdown, 15 to 20 days of oil remaining. Cuba validates what Venezuela already proved. Economic models built on external subsidies collapse the moment the patron disappears. Venezuela had oil infrastructure to reactivate post-Maduro. Cuba has nothing but hope for external rescue. Russia and China pledge solidarity, but won't risk direct confrontation with the U.S. in its sphere of influence. Symbolic shipments buy time. They don't change trajectories. Multipolar world order means rhetorical support and limited material aid, not decisive intervention. Maximum pressure works when you control the choke point, and your adversary can't survive without it. Cuba needs 60,000 barrels per day. It has 15 days of reserves. The math is unforgiving. This isn't political propaganda. This is 11 million people facing blackouts, hunger, disease outbreaks. The oil countdown has no ideology. By March 2026, we'll know the answer. Capturing Maduro on January 3rd might have signed Cuba's death warrant. Or it might force the regime change Washington's pursued for 65 years. Or it might trigger the great power confrontation everyone tried to avoid. It's February 2026. Cuba has 15 to 20 days of oil left. The countdown continues right now. The verdict isn't in yet, but the clock is running. If you made it this far, you understand something most people scrolling YouTube will never see. This crisis isn't entertainment. It's 11 million lives hanging in the balance while superpowers play chess with their survival. Hit that subscribe button right now because by March we'll know whether Cuba found a way out or whether the countdown hit 0. I'll be documenting exactly what happens either way with the data and analysis the mainstream media won't touch. Drop a comment telling me which scenario you think plays out. Managed degradation, negotiated transition, internal fracture, because your analysis matters. The people watching this channel aren't passive consumers. You're people who understand that geopolitics isn't theory. It's real consequences for real people. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what's actually happening 90 miles from Miami while the world looks away. Not for algorithm points, because this story deserves to be told before it's too late. The clock is ticking. 15 days. Let's see what happens next.